in the United States when my dad was working at MIT. I very much agree that it's opportunity, economic, but also professional, which is so important to attracting people, but conditions of freedom. And you really don't produce graduates in the way that you produce products. You know, people earn their degree, and it's their personal creativity which makes them creative and intelligent. And it's very difficult to tell somebody to solve that problem. On a good day, I reckon I might possibly be able to inspire one of my colleagues to give a brilliant lecture. I can't tell them to teach brilliantly, and it's true for all professional activities if you think about it. So governments have the responsibility to lead by attracting, not to lead by telling.
Thank you. Let's go right over here. Lady in the front row, sorry to work you on the microphone.
Thank you. I'm Primrose Kurasha. I'm Vice-Chancellor, Zimbabwe Open University. And thank you so much for the discussion that's going on. I just thought, coming from an open and distance learning institution, maybe we want to look at it from a university's point of view and say open and distance learning could be one way of mitigating against brain drain. In other words, the clientele or the learners that you get in open and distance learning are usually mature learners who are at home, who are settled in their country. And what you do as universities is upskill them, enhance their skills, bring them to a better level where they can make a better contribution to the economic development of the nation. So let's use that route to develop those that have remained, and that gives the brain gain more than the brain drain. I thank you.
We've only really got time for one more, and there's a gentleman in the front row there. Yep.
Thank you. I'm Edem Adubra from UNESCO. I head the teacher program of UNESCO. And when I hear brain drain, it means brain drain to me from the point of view of teacher supply. And when we think about the attrition in the profession in African countries, and then we know that the governments invest in training those people to lead education, and they leave the profession, you cannot all of a sudden replace them. And in the exact time, it's a loss to the country which invests. So there is a need for establishing measures, guidelines to control the movement so that the poorest countries who invest in training people are not victimized by this attraction by other countries or other, developed countries. So I think it's a brain drain, even if the gains are in the communities or in the families of the individuals who leave the society that they were trained to provide service to the citizen of the country. So thank you.
Thank you all for those comments for the moment. I'm Quentin Cooper, and this is The Forum from the BBC. Now, today we've been talking about the brain drain and how it affects different countries. So far, we've concentrated on the causes and symptoms. Now, we're going to get on to what can help countries that want to hold on to more of their best and brightest people when they feel the pull to take their skills overseas. With me here at the Going Global Conference in Cape Town are Professor Olusola Oyewole, President of the Association of African Universities and Vice-Chancellor of the Federal University of Agriculture at Abeokuta in Nigeria, Dr. Joe Beale, Director of Education and Society at the British Council and former Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Cape Town University, Tao Shea, Professor of Political Science at Beijing Foreign Studies University, and Caroline Medel-Ananuevo, UNESCO's Head of Education, Southern Africa Region. Now, the easiest problems to solve are those that when you look at, you realise aren't really problems at all. But I imagine I'm not going to find too much sympathy here to the idea that in global terms there is no brain drain. No country is hogging all these talents. They are simply moving around. So aren't we better to think of this as being skills shortages arising from demand for particular fields of work, and that simply some countries are better at plugging those gaps than others, Joe?
I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it. What we know from migration studies is that people with talent, people with some resources, some opportunities, are the ones that move. So that does pose a problem for the countries from which they leave, because global talent is pulled. It's as much pull as push. I'm not sure if you want to look at solutions at this point.
Oh, yes.
But, if you look at South Africa, which is a country I've had a long association with, and if you look at China, Professor Xi's country, Both of us are associated with countries that have in the past, not in the present, but in the past had very draconian policies that have tried to stop people moving. Under apartheid, there were the pass laws. In China, people were discouraged through access to social services from moving. Now, in both cases, looked at over the long term, this resulted in spectacular failure.
Yes, the best way to hold on to talent is not to hold on to talent.
Exactly. So I think if we are starting to look at policies, we have to be very careful about draconian policies, about walls, about barriers, because they don't work.
Carolyn, going back to how we began and the origins of brain drain in response to that speech in the UK House of Lords by the then Science Minister, Viscount Hailsham, he spoke about while two-way traffic is always healthy, if it's too much in one direction is not. Is that perhaps the key to this? He's not trying to say we can't have this, it's making sure it's sufficiently well regulated that we maximise the benefits and minimise the losses.
It depends from which perspective you're talking about.
I'm trying to talk from a global perspective, which of course is the hardest one to do.
Yes, because if I look at the Philippines, for example, if you look at what is the environment, what drives people away. So the question is what happens to this new, because the whole discussion earlier was about how do you now train and put to school a new generation of teachers, nurses, and doctors. And in the Philippines, that's what's happening, and that's the other so negative side of it. We're just churning out nurses. We are producing nurses to supply Germany, UK, and the States. Our doctors are also supplied. But like in some universities, they really make it up. They have a policy, like in the University of the Philippines, that you cannot leave until you graduate for 2-3 years after. Because what happens is they're still just training, and immediately nurses said, oh, I'm training to just get experience so I can go to Saudi, to the UK.
But presumably if you have a policy where you can't leave for, let's say, 2 years or 3 years, what you get is a cliff after those 2 or 3 years as everybody gets there and then goes.
Yeah, and I think that's the challenge, because many people can be very creative. They are able to go around these policies, and we Filipinos, I think, are very creative and flexible. So we're able to get around these policies. So in the end, I think...
Especially when the best and the brightest, they'll find the ways around.
Yes, exactly. And I think the challenge is also how the receiving countries are also trying to see how to amend this. And I have a very good example of Germany, for example. I know that, for example, for Germany, they have this program where if I am a migrant, if I have stayed in Germany and I have decided to go back to my country, they have a reintegration program where they give you funds to establish yourself in your own country. So for me, this is one key. I was surprised that this was being done, no? To have such a reintegration fund where you are able to say, okay, I am now going back to my country, but given that I have been uprooted economically, I am given funds to start up. No? So I think that's one good practice.
Professor Tausche, we talked in the first half about how China was facing the biggest brain drain in the world. What are they doing about it?
Well, the Chinese government has done many things. For one example is a 1,000 talent program for Chinese nationals who are based in the U.S. or in the U.K. These very prominent labs. And also now we have a new program for 1,000 talent for foreigners. So we try to attract foreigners. But again, there are many problems, I would say, obstacles to China's efforts to retain or attract talents. China is becoming much better in terms of hardware. Look at the Chinese labs in terms of money that the Chinese government allocates for like Tsinghua University and Peking University. But then in terms of software, like the way that you administer the research personnel, how people can apply for grants, and how these grants are spent. For example, today there are many, many restrictions on how you can spend your money. And those restrictions can be very much discouraging to people who are used to a different set of rules and norms. People who, say, come back from the US or from the UK, where there's a much more trust for academics. They don't really presume that you would use the money for your personal expenses. You would put the money in your own personal bank accounts, right? So that kind of a trust is missing